Welcome back to America at 250, the podcast. I'm Beverly Gage, and I am once again here with my colleagues, co-teachers in this strange enterprise, Joanne Freeman and David Blight. Today, we don't have much to do except figure out what caused the Civil War and what it all meant. And we will attempt to do that in the next 45 minutes or so.
Piece of cake.
So, David, we're gonna plunge in with a set of questions for you. Tuesday's lecture was secession. Today we moved on to the Civil War. We got through the pivotal year of 1864, though we have not gotten to the end of the war yet. But the big question of your lectures, of the reading this week, is how do we understand why, after decades of compromise, of trying to hold the political system together, trying to hold the Union together, that fails in this moment of 1860-61. Give us the definitive answer on that.
Not a big question at all.
The one definitive answer, no, there's never a single cause to anything, as we were all taught. It's 40 years from, let's just say, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which established the latitudinal line across the country, above which slavery wasn't supposed to exist. It's 40 years until 1860. So we're talking two different generations of American political leadership, almost three. By the time of the Mexican War, the American political party system was already breaking at the edges to some degree over the slavery question. And when we say slavery question, we mean generally slavery in the future. Slavery's expansion into the West. Many have said without the significance of westward expansion, there would never have been a civil war. Well, probably true. We don't know that definitively either. But the issue became, would the United States have a free labor future or a slave labor future? Would the American South, whose population was far less than the growing and booming northern states, ever be able to maintain what it conceived of as parity in the U.S. Congress, especially the U.S. Senate, if they could not expand west, if they could not have an equal number of slave states to free states? But what eventually occurs in the wake of the Mexican War, in the wake of the ultimately futile Compromise of 1850, is that the American political party system, the American political culture generally begins to first erode, then dissolve, and then break apart. And it breaks apart particularly by 1854 in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was the attempt by the U.S. Senate to establish a means of settling the vast Kansas-Nebraska territory, which was everything from Kansas all the way up north of the Canadian border and all the way out to what we now call Montana. Vast expanse of the West. Would that be slave territory or free territory? And Stephen Douglas's bill in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, because his feet were put to the fire by Southern Democrats, it repealed openly, explicitly repealed the 1820 Missouri Compromise line, which had always been conceived of by Northern politicians, and this included a lot of Democrats, as a, quote, sacred pledge, unquote, that slavery could never expand to that region. Whatever would be done with Kansas and Nebraska, the law said, it can never be slave territory or slave states. And then, of course, came the outbreak of a border civil war in Kansas with Missouri. Pro-slavery people and anti-slavery people went to war, village against village, farm against farm, town against town, in 1855-56. But a big pivot in this, and I tried to make a case for that in the lecture, is the Dred Scott decision of 1857. And we might dwell on that a moment because it is a kind of point of no return, at least politically, and legally, depending on how you interpreted it, because the Dred Scott case says that Dred Scott and his family did not receive freedom because of their residence on northern soil, whether that's a free state or free territory. It's even going to say, in Justice Taney's effort to go even further, that the federal court should never have even taken this case, shouldn't have had jurisdiction. But since they did, they go so far as to repeal. They say first that Scott shall not receive his freedom. Then Taney wrote, for the majority, 7-2, that black people have no rights which white people are bound to respect, ever again. Such that after the day after the Dred Scott decision, if you were a black American, you lived in the land of the Dred Scott decision, which says you have no future as citizens. You have no future with any kind of political or civil liberty. And further, it went on then to explicitly repeal the old Missouri line. This then was interpreted by the new Republican Party, which is now already 3 years old, as, in effect, telling them to take a hike, that their purpose, their reason to be, which was to stop the westward expansion of slavery, their reason to be has no legal authority. Hence, the Republican Party, from the Dred Scott decision on for the next 3 years, and we saw that, the emphasis I placed on Lincoln's House Divided speech, which was his announcement for the Senate in 1858, the Republican Party begins to build its identity in opposition to the Dred Scott decision, vehement opposition to it, and you begin to see this polarization to turn into a kind of unreconcilable rift. Now, the rift could still have somehow ended up not in war, and we've all talked about this a bit before. You can argue that the conflict now is perhaps irrepressible or all but inevitable after 1857, but it doesn't necessarily mean that secession and war are. Those become a whole new set of decisions that are made on both sides. But the course of events in the 1850s severed American political culture, as obviously never before, brought the birth of an anti-slavery political party which turns out to have created a potent coalition of Northerners, Democrats, old Whigs, nativists, and lots of others who came together because they all feared the power of slavery and the power of slave labor if it expanded west.
Okay, I'm going to jump in because we can't go year by year, blow by blow, necessarily.
Oh, you look so concerned, David.
Even though I would probably keep doing that if you didn't stop me. Yes, it's true.
And get anywhere.
We all walk in here thinking, now I can cover what I didn't cover in the lecture, see, but we can't do that.
Yeah. I want to turn to the reading this week, which is specifically about secession. So we are all reading, students in the class, a book by a historian named Charles Dew called Apostles of Disunion. And that book has a very clear and clean purpose, which is to take up, I guess, partly the question of the causes of the Civil War, but really specifically, when Southern states seceded, how did they talk to each other about what they were doing, what their reasons were, what they were trying to defend? And the central claim of this book, and it's quite a persuasive claim, is that they were talking about slavery and the racial order when they got together and tried to persuade each other to do what is actually this really radical thing, right? Something that Joanne's founders feared would happen in their moment.
And
it
almost
was
did.
Always possible but it did only happen in a serious way once, right? But a radical thing, we now kind of take it for granted. There was secession, then there was a civil war. But uncertain moment. So do you want to talk to us a little bit about Charles Dew and why you assigned that book and why you think it's valuable?
Yes, secession is the biggest rupture in American history. It certainly leads to the biggest rupture in American history. But it does tie back to, as we keep saying, Joanne's section, just how fragile that republic was, how fragile the Union was, how frightened they were that they were losing their Union. Pick your moment of the 1790s. Pick 1800, but pick even a few moments after that. There'd been talk of secession and talk of leaving by Southerners if they didn't get their way for a long time, and there'd been fear of disunion. The word disunion is all over the press and all over political culture throughout the 1850s. But no one ever quite put their money where their mouth was. This time it appears they might in that election of 1860. Charles Dew's book went and studied a set of sources that I don't think most of us even knew about. I didn't, although I'm not really a scholar of secession. But these were called secession commissioners. Each one of the 7 Deep South states that seceded between December 60 and February 61, sent these commissioners, some states more than one, up to the Upper South. Still 8 slave states had not seceded from the Union. They're recruiting them. In effect, these are recruiters to state legislatures, to governor's offices, to newspapers, where they're publishing op-eds. And they're trying to convince their fellow Southerners in the Upper South states, where slavery is not as significant in some of those states as it was in Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi. They're trying to convince them to join them. So the arguments they're making are join. Turns out to preserve our slave system, preserve our racial order, preserve the future as we understand it, preserve our civilization. Yes, they make arguments about state sovereignty and states' rights. They're seceding for their liberties, their God-given liberties. They're calling themselves the vessel of the American Revolution and so on. But they are very explicit that this is about preserving their racial system and their system of slave labor. Join us now before it's too late. And it's a fascinating way of seeing into, so what's secession really about? And we've debated this in America ever since. And Charlie Dew's book came along about 20 years ago, and now everybody in my field teaches it, partly because it's so short.
Nice and short.
Nice and short. And it's got this very clear argument. He hangs them, so to speak, on their own petard.
But I want to make a point about that is not a surprising point in any way, but I think it's an easily overlooked point when you're thinking about the big question about the cause of the Civil War, and people are saying maybe it's states' rights, and then other people are saying states' rights to do what? Oh, to own enslaved people. So of course we know slavery is at the heart of it. Of course we know the race is at the heart of slavery. But part of what this book does really effectively is, given that it's showing that these commissioners are going to fellow Southerners to try to persuade them to secede from the Union, they're talking about and saying what they think will be a really persuasive argument. And what they're going on, pointing to again and again and again, is race, right? We're gonna be making Black people equal to us. Heaven forbid. We're going to be mixing white and Black people. So the degree to which it's not
explicitly they address intermarriage.
Well, exactly. It's the race component. It's not that it's shocking that they're talking about race. It's that it's not just slavery. When they're really trying to push comes to shove, you have to join us. What they're appealing to is just pure racial panic, racial order. This is going to destroy everything, not just even our order, our social order. It's going to destroy society, and it's going to do that by what it's going to allow Black people to become in the South.
I'm glad you put it that way, because years ago now, there was a spate of books about secession and the coming of the Civil War that got sort of lumped under the phrase the fear thesis. And it was always quite compelling to me, and I think a lot of other people. Some of these books are 40 and 50 years old, but it still makes sense. There's a great deal of fear between the two societies, if we want to call them that, a great deal of political fear, racial fear, social fear, that the order of society is going to fall apart. It's going to fall apart if you let abolitionists run this government, if you're the Southerner. It's going to fall apart if you're a Northerner, if you let slaveholders rule this society and rule the West and rule the government. And they have reached a point now, and I don't think it's overstressing the point, where they had, to a degree, conspiratorial visions of each other. They feared each other for pretty good reasons in some ways. Did they know this was going to result in war yet? Did they have any idea the kind of war this would become? Of course not. People never do on the eve of conflict. But there's a fear, especially after Dred Scott politically and legally and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry physically. John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry was every Southern planter's worst nightmare. Some Yankee, crazy, fanatical abolitionist, some radical left lunatic was going to get up a band of men and come marching into the South and incite a slave insurrection. Well, lo and behold, it happened. And now they knew what that could look like, what it could mean, and there may be 100 other John Browns waiting to do it, they said.
But here's the thing about fear, and part of why this is so effective, right? Yeah. Fear and politics. If you can convince people in a political environment, when you're trying to get people to act politically, if you can get them to be afraid of their opponents, fear is visceral. Fear bypasses intellect. Fear bypasses reasoning. Fear bypasses all the things that hold people back. If you could really get people in a state of fear, they're going to join together and act on the basis of emotion and not on the basis of reasoning.
And I've said before in this studio that in the 3 presidential elections before 1860, it's the largest voter turnouts of American history. The slavery issue turned people out. In some states, as much as 90%.
But what struck me about this fear theme, not just about Dew, but about your lectures today and the way that you were describing these kind of clashing worldviews that are developing, that are total worldviews. They are all-encompassing. Yes, slavery is the touchstone, but what you think on that question suggests what you think on lots and lots of other questions about your family, about your work, about the economic system, about virtue, about union, about the founders. Right?
What's a Fifth Amendment?
You could go on and on. And so what everyone seems to be doing in a political situation like this is trying to predict the future, right? There is a record of the past, right? So that Dred Scott decision, that was bad. Or John Brown, what John Brown did was terrible. But those are almost always being talked about, terrible because if we do not stop it, it will lead to X, right? So the founders talked a lot. We had a little discussion about the Stamp Act way back when, like, what's the big deal? It doesn't seem like that big a deal, right? But there were connections being made. If we allow this, tyranny is next. And there's so much of this language that is trying to project some sort of apocalyptic future that is about fear, but it's also about just trying to see what's ahead of you. And what is striking to me is the intensity of those future predictions, how people really thought they knew what was coming, and then how the very thing that was in fact coming, as a result of that, nobody could see at all.
And that's so bound up. It's a wonderful point because that future vision is so bound up with like a passionate desire for what you think is right and a fear of not knowing what's coming along and a kind of sense of urgency to do something. I mean, you know, the feeling of moments of extreme contingency in American history when you don't, I mean, we never know what's coming next, but there are moments like this moment or like the revolutionary moment, and you will have moments we will get to when we get to your lectures.
There are more wars to come.
There are more wars to come. But there are extreme moments, right, where people can see that there's a vision of the nation being debated in some way that gets, again, a mix of passion and vision and fear and conspiracy. And there are moments that are extremely intense in that way. And that I think for historians, when we look at those moments, it becomes important for us to try and, to the best that we can, crawl into the heads of the people that we're writing about to try and get to the heart of looking in hindsight. It's entirely easy to miss.
Well, you know, there was almost a throwaway moment in one of my lectures where
there are no throwaway moments in lectures, everyone. Every word is important.
Well, I hope you caught this one out there in podcast land, because in Lincoln's House Divided speech, right after all the poetry about a house divided, he says what his party stands for is putting slavery on a course of ultimate extinction. That's pretty clear. And Southerners never let him forget he used that phrase. A year later, after John Brown's raid, everybody in the country was talking about John Brown's raid. At press, the editorial pages, everywhere. And in the wake of the raid and John Brown's hanging, there was a Boston newspaper that had an editorial that said, well, they say John Brown was crazy, but maybe all that means is that 75% of the people in Massachusetts are stark raving mad. Because
there are many who would still say that.
Well, that's probably true. But the point was people were saying, we're against what John Brown did. That kind of violence, that kind of political violence is horrible. It's terrible. He murdered people for freedom. Terrible. But he was kind of right. Now, in a culture, political culture that has come to communicate in those ways, you're in danger. It doesn't mean there's going to be war just yet, but you're really in danger because there's nowhere to go. There's no middle ground to go find unless you find some kind of religious substance around which to gather. But even the theologians and the ministers, as I pointed out in lecture, the sermons on that fasting day in January 1861 are just preaching hellfire at each other. And when even the ministers are doing it, and in effect promoting, if not violence, they're promoting conflict, you're in danger.
Before we leave Charles Dew's book, I want to bring up something that several students brought up in discussion posts. And yes, we sometimes read your discussion posts, even though your section instructors are the ones who assigned it, and we're not sitting in section. But
we're not hiding from you.
We do look at what you're writing sometimes. And several students brought up a story that Dew told. That was a book that was written in 2001. Yeah. And he said, when you take the civics section of a U.S. citizenship test and you have to get to the history part, there are two acceptable answers to what caused the Civil War. One, slavery. One, states' rights. And so I wondered if that was still the case. And so I went to the primary sources, which is the latest edition that I could find from the U.S. government, the civics test that people take as they're becoming U.S. citizens. So a couple of things were interesting to me. One is that the question is gone. As far as I can tell, and I wonder if
when,
you,
right?
Huh?
I'd be curious to know.
I do not know when.
Fascinating to know when.
And I could theorize, and I have suspicions, but we work with evidence, and so I do not know. But I wondered if you had reflections on that, and then I thought you might answer a couple of the questions that are on the test and see how well your answers match up with the answers.
I'm taking the citizenship oath
of the U.S. government.
Here. Oh boy!
All right. So do you have thoughts on the disappearance of the question?
Oh gosh! Well, there could have been a political moment here in the last 20 years, even the last 5 years, where someone, maybe whoever is doing these things.
Tell.
Yeah, it's kind of a don't ask, don't tell. But it's also, they may have finally decided, this one's just too ridiculous and stark. They have to choose one or the other, and it's not one or the other. History rarely is just one or the other, but people want it to be. I said in lecture, we like our Abraham Lincoln pure, but we also like our Civil War causation pure. It has to be one or the other, and it's not. I'd like to know when that happened and why. I wonder if out there people have ever, those who already have their birthright citizenship, if you go for a visa to go live abroad for a year, you have to go to a citizenship office. I did that once, and I sat there having to wait for 3 hours, watching the film that everyone has to watch before they take their citizenship test. And it was fascinating to realize the images, the stories that film is telling. Talk about generalizations. But there was a fair amount about the civil rights movement in it. There was a little bit about the Civil War. But of course, everything gets all right again in America. That's what they want people to know. So it may have been just that let's get the Civil War off the plate because it's just too messy.
Well, there are still some Civil War questions.
Oh, there are?
So there are two questions to which the Civil War is the answer. One is name the U.S. war between the North and South. That's the Civil War. And the other is what U.S. war ended slavery. That's also the Civil War. But we have, I'm going to ask you.
How about Bleeding Kansas?
I'm going to ask you two, and then I have one or two for Joanne too.
Okay.
So here's one. The Civil War, this could go on forever since I'm asking David Blight. The Civil War had many important events, but you can only name one.
In the middle of the war.
The Civil War had many important events. Name one. That's the question.
What I would name?
Yeah.
The election of 1864. The election of 1864.
Which you made the point in lecture today.
I did, and I could have made it even more fully. But it is a unique situation. It's an absolutely pivotal election. If it turns out the other way, the result of this war could have been quite different. It has all sorts of contingent moments that bring it about. It's all about slavery, and it's about political survival.
And the political process. So when you said that in lecture, what it made me think, because you said that, and you said a little earlier, one of the problems that the Confederacy had during the war was that they didn't have a party system.
Right.
They just had, the Confederacy, the party of the Confederacy, and that was a problem in allowing it to function. And what that made me think, and this point as well, is the degree to which the political process, we think of it as just sort of the conveyor belt of American politics. Yeah. But that is American politics. And if you don't have a way for that to function, if the process itself, to organize it, to push it forward, the engine of it,
manageable conflict.
Well, exactly. That's how politics works, right? And so it makes perfect sense to me that an election in the middle of a war and that process, that political process in motion and doing what it's supposed to do is really important because ultimately the process is what holds us together.
And by the way, that is not to diminish the significance of the Battle of Antietam, the Battle of Gettysburg, and the Siege of Vicksburg.
I'm sorry to say that you all should not listen to either one of these people.
No, because we're wrong.
Because the 1864 election is not on the list of important things that happened in the Civil War. Fort Sumter, Emancipation, Battle of Vicksburg, Battle of Gettysburg, Sherman's March, surrender at Appomattox, Battle of Antietam/Sharpsburg, Lincoln was assassinated.
Emancipation would be the real answer there since you have to do multiple choice, but emancipation is all over the election of 1864. One other quick thing to Joanne's point, it's so important. One of the great questions about the Civil War that endures is what was this thing called the Confederacy? We've never had anything quite like it. I always say it's the largest dissent in American history. No one else has ever quite done that. What is it? Is it a country? Is it a fledgling set of ideas that becomes a nationalism for a while? Is it an insurgency? Is it a military insurgency? And what we call it may not be the most important thing in the end, but it's real. And it almost won the war. So how we remember it is an eternal question.
And the words that we use to define it.
Well, and I would say, one of the things that makes that question so difficult is that sometimes when we narrate history, we let people declare things and then we say, okay, the declaration is self-executing. A law was passed. A declaration was made. A secession ordinance was written. And historians tend to let it happen and then assume that it's self-executing and it all goes from there.
Explain it later.
And part of the reason that it's so hard to answer this question about the Confederacy is first, they were making it up as they went along, and it wasn't there for very long, right?
No, 4 years. 4 years, but did unbelievable almost damage. It's the marker in some ways, the deepest marker of American history, and it's worth using some what if contingent questions about it. At what point in the war, at what point here, at what point there might the Confederacy actually have succeeded? Because to win the war, the Confederates didn't have to conquer the North. They didn't have to conquer Washington, D.C., although they actually tried. They simply had to fight long enough to make the North quit.
Well, this is often the narrative about the American Revolution that we spent all this time talking. Why did the Americans win? Well, they were just defending their homes and they just wanted the British to leave. And so that's in many cases used as the explanation for success.
Well, then military historians of the Civil War love this question because then they get to argue, not without good reason, about certain decisions that are made during the war, especially by Robert E. Lee, who invaded the North twice. Had he not invaded the North and remained on the defensive in Virginia, which was kind of congenitally against his instincts, it's possible the Confederacy indeed could have held out long enough. That what if, I think, is always interesting because it sets up then a whole set of questions about American liberty and freedom and rights that we now assume, of course, we were going to get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. No, there is no 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments without the emancipation of 4 million slaves. And if the Confederacy succeeds on any level, there's really no emancipation.
It raises an important point, which is certainly true in my time period, but I think it's eternally true. So in my time period, the big fear was that if something was done that was extreme or dangerous or bad, like creating the Confederacy, that was going to potentially change things for all time. Forever. It was going to change, the whole experiment. We're all going to go down. That kind of thing, even if it only lasts for 3 or 4 years, is precedent setting. The fear is setting a precedent. And the fact of the matter is that is true in history, is that even if something you can't say, this in and of itself did these total apocalyptic things, with or without the apocalypse, the fact that it happened, the fact that it existed, and the fact that it had an impact, that precedent is huge.
And since you used the word apocalyptic, I'm very glad you did, because Americans were conditioned by their religious sensibilities, by their cosmologies, their Christian cosmologies, North and South. They belong to the same denominations by and large. They were conditioned, generations, to see history in a kind of theological way. They, on whatever level people believed it, they did believe God was involved in history. And, of course, the Old Testament is full of apocalyptic change, apocalyptic moments, renderings, destructions and remakings and rebirths and so on. After all, why did Douglas use a Noah's Ark? It's the oldest rebirth story in Western civilization. So this idea that something could happen to the model republic that would obliterate it and force it to be remade is not. It's understandable to most Americans. They don't like it. They don't want it. They want to win without having to lose hundreds of thousands of people and treasure. But they've been kind of theologically prepared for this in their worldviews. That's a good way of thinking about it. There is a kind of religious, partly secular. A lot of people have said Americans had a hybrid enlightenment. It was partly secular and partly religious. So, and the more blood that is shed, we've seen this in other wars, the bloodier this thing got, the more theological it became to people because they have to find a way to explain this now.
I was going to say, how do you reckon with it?
How do you
explain it?
How do you justify it?
Yeah.
If you saw the fields at Spotsylvania Courthouse, if you saw the fields at Gettysburg, you are going to be, and if you smelled them, I'm being honest here, we now have studies of the senses at battlefields in that war. You'd be hard-pressed to just explain it to somebody without relying on some kind of higher understandings. And once it reaches that point, it lends itself to totality. We talk a lot about the Civil War being the first total war. And as I said in my lecture, that's not just a measure of weaponry or technology. It's one measure. But it's about the causes. It's about the purposes of it. It's about how fundamentally both societies were mobilized to fight it and to destroy the other side. And that's where emancipation becomes so important to the story. Emancipation became a way of winning the war and a way of transforming the United States.
I was just going to jump in and talk about this. So historians, when people say, what is the method of a historian? We can talk a lot about going to evidence and going to various forms of interpretation. But historians go to this phrase, change over time, right? That you're starting in one place with something that happened and you end somewhere else at a later moment and something happens in between and that's history. And with the Civil War, what's really so dramatic is not just this onward march of events, right? And this terrible war that is developing and spinning out of control as people are experiencing it. So much worse.
The killing got out of control.
So much worse than many people understood it to be. But it also has this kind of deepening and radicalizing process for so many of the people involved, whether you're talking about ordinary soldiers, whether you're talking about enslaved people who decide to liberate themselves, join the Union Army, flee, a whole set of actions there. Or you're talking about a figure like Abraham Lincoln, who you discussed in class a little bit today, who I think for many historians is sort of the model of someone who is fixed in his own moment, but through the course of events and through an encounter with new ideas and new circumstances and new experiences also changes over time. So Lincoln is a dramatic example, but that's the story of the Civil War for a whole lot of people.
But that's also, so you use the phrase total war as one society trying to wipe out another society. I mean, all warfare is bad. Warfare is one side against another, but there's a level of warfare.
Oh, yeah. Some of them are limited.
Right. And
limited
some of them, like this,
means.
are wiping out one side, sort of wiping out another is a different level. And part of what you're talking about here is you can, at the same time that you have that, again, apocalyptic understanding of things, you're talking about, and it's vitally important to understand, the ground level reality of people in that moment changing and experiencing and what it feels like and how you respond to and change within those kinds of, again, I'm going to keep saying apocalyptic because that's what a civil war of that magnitude feels like. But the reality of that, and whether it's Lincoln or an enslaved person deciding that they need to fight or whatever, the fact that those are moments of transformative change in the nation, which causes transformative change in people.
And today in the lecture, I played part of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and everyone will remember kind of laughingly that they heard it and sang part of it. But that is a bloody, apocalyptic paean. If you go read the lyrics of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, it is go make war for God and country
terrible
and
swift sword.
Terrible swift sword. And both sides had, quote, heard the trumpet that could never call a retreat. I mean, Julia Ward Howe was writing an apocalyptic hymn. She already had the tune ready to go, or it wasn't her tune, but it was her lyrics. And Americans, North and South, had various kinds of battle hymns of the Republic. So I don't want to overstress this because it's still a daily process, but this war makes, frankly, thousands upon thousands of young men into killers, into men who would, as their examples in Drew Faust's book on death in the Civil War, she has an episode that will just blow you away where she cites a Union platoon that had killed 25 or 30 Confederate soldiers, and instead of burying them, which is what you're supposed to do in war, they stuffed them all down a well. And then they shouted for joy. And that's when you realize, oh, Lord, this war's out of control. It's turning men into killers. They may or may not even know what they did this for, but a civil war goes there. And it becomes very local in some ways.
Not all civil wars, right?
No.
So because what's interesting, what this makes me think of, because the Revolution was a civil war.
Sure was, especially in the South.
People at the time called it a civil war. Hamilton called it the Civil War. So it is a civil war.
Well, he didn't live for the other one.
Well, he didn't. I don't know. That's a really, all by itself, a really interesting question. Like, what would he have thought? But besides what I was thinking,
it
all comes back. So, warning, it will all come back to Hamilton.
Right.
David
He
Blight,
did not live for
earlier,
1861.
We were drinking our Poland spring water, and David said Frederick Douglass once went to Poland. So it's all Frederick
It
Douglass.
was
it's all
a resort
Hamilton.
in the 1880s.
But
He went there when his wife died.
The point I wanted to make was, I was once at a symposium of historians of the American Revolution and historians of the French Revolution.
Oh, yeah.
And we were there to find common ground, like thinking about revolution. And what we found was that the French Revolution is a social revolution. Mass bloodshed in the streets, people, one class trying to kill off another class. I mean, it was a big, bloody battle. And not that the revolution wasn't bloody and wasn't hard fought, but it was a different kind of civil war, right? And so it was fascinating to me to sit at that table with these, historians in the mix of these two major transformative moments. And they were very different moments, and now we're talking about another kind of one that's very different.
Yeah, well, war is a hideous thing, obviously, and then the 20th century is going to make it even more hideous. But this war did transform culture. It transformed writing. It transformed music. It transformed photography.
Matthew Brady.
It comes at the dawn of photography. Photography, daguerreotypes have been around for nearly 20 years before the Civil War, but this is the first mass-scale event ever photographed, and we have hundreds of them now. And it's one of the reasons the realism of the Civil War is at least possible, although Americans have gone to great extents to walk around that, to deny it, to avoid it. We don't like the realism of that war.
Can I ask a question about how we know what we know? So we got a few questions in from students in the class. A couple of them are about documents and about how we want to understand the historical record. So one was just a question about a slide that you put up in class, the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, and then there were a set of questions for Joanne about Madison and his notes and how we understand what was going on in that moment. But I would say also for the Civil War more broadly, you were making the case in class today that the way that we are able to understand and relate to the Civil War is through the poetry and literature of that moment, but especially through letters and through the testimony in writing of ordinary people and what they were experiencing. So we have some textual questions that came in, but we also have this question. Since you titled your lecture, The Civil War and Its Meanings.
Yes. Well, letters, I'll take that up first. It's the most letter-writing event, I guess, the world had ever seen till then, because so many people were away from home. Hundreds of thousands, millions of letters exist. Hundreds of thousands of them are still in state historical societies. Every now and then there's another collection of Civil War letters published. I did a book of letters myself back 25 years ago of a Massachusetts soldier, and I had sworn I would never edit a book of Civil War letters. There's just too many of them until I saw these letters. Oh, my God. This guy wrote long 3, 4, and 5-page letters all the time to his mother and his sisters. He was a kid from western Massachusetts who had nothing else going in life. And the letters are just a revelation of the values of a young man in the middle of the 19th century. They're also a revelation of his racial views. And he was a racist to the bone, but he was a Lincoln voter. So letters tell us often a great deal. And the women's letters from this war has made a women's history, women's diaries and letters have made a women's history of the American Civil War a huge part of women's history because they left so much material to work with, especially those Southern diarists. Oh, Lord. But, you know, it's a transformative social experience. And when social history finally found the Civil War, we started getting, unsurprisingly, studies of towns and localities. Well, what happened in that New Hampshire town or that Massachusetts town or that Georgia town? Turns out half the military-age men died in the war. All the families were affected. The businesses transformed. Of course, they all eventually had to build their own monument. So towns would never forget this experience if for no other reason than they lost half their men. And that meant half the women lost their mates, their brothers, their fathers, and so on. Loss. I've always maintained this, and I have a whole lecture I do on this, not in this course, but that one of the reasons we're so drawn to the lore, to the stories, to the history of the Civil War is loss. Americans have never lost so much in such a concentrated period of time in all of their history. Even World War II doesn't compare in terms of numbers, scale perhaps, but the sheer degree of loss that people went through. And that forces, of course, you to fall back upon your philosophical, religious, social worldviews. How do you explain all that loss?
But also to tie it to what Bev asked about, right? Those are the things that get reflected in personal letters.
Oh, God, yes.
The loss, the feeling, the emotion, the reality in a way that, isms and sweeping views can't capture. So in your case, these documents capture like a real essence of what's going on. The question that came to me from this student was about James Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention. Now, there's a document that is typically taken to be Madison, like very religiously almost took notes about everything.
Yeah.
He took notes as the debates were going on.
We're supposed to believe it all, aren't we?
Well, that's the thing, right? He took these notes, he transcribed them at night, he asked people if they were accurate or not, right? It was meant to be, in one way or another, an accurate record of how this happened. And this book by Mary Sarah Bilder called Madison's Hand, she talks about the fact that in later years, and particularly in the 1790s when, and this actually gets back to what we were talking about, Madison and Jefferson thought that their vision of the republic and what the nation should be might be going down in flames because of Hamilton and his ilk and the horrible world they wanted to create. So Madison tinkers with the notes in these later years, which in a way you could say is like blasphemy, right? Because that's what we trust.
He's doctoring his notes.
And that's what people look to now to understand the Constitutional Convention. So there's a case in which the documents, they're recording the reality of a political moment, but you can't necessarily trust the full reality of it in that original
The most famous woman's diary from the Civil War is Mary Chestnut's diary. I quoted her in my lecture today, and this may have been a throwaway line. Mary Chestnut's diary was not ultimately a diary. She returned to it later in life. She rewrote it into essentially a novelistic sort of diary. And no less than C. Van Woodward brought out a new modern edition of it that showed that this was as much novel as diary, and he won the Pulitzer Prize. That's how Woodward got the Pulitzer Prize, on Mary Chestnut's doctored diary.
Another man stealing a woman's work. There we go.
I'm not carrying a pail for C. Van here, but it was an amazing
reality, right? Because in the case,
let C. Van Woodward off
in the case of that, but the reality of the Civil War and an emotional reality of the Civil War, in the case of the Bilder book about Madison, and that what we take is like almost gospel about what happened at the convention with the Constitution, the sort of ultimate pact, not necessarily being the way that we decided.
Well, it's that human urge to know.
Yeah.
We want to know that that's the truth.
The historian urge
there's
to look
so
at
much
a
that we don't
document,
know is the truth. At least Madison gave us what went on, right?
Very carefully, with this little tiny Madison handwriting.
And I will say that the Charles Dew book, one of the things that makes it so satisfying is precisely that. You feel like, now we're in their private conversations that we never saw before. But of course, it's worth being suspicious even about that because people are multifaceted. They say one thing to one audience and one thing to another.
And since you brought up training of historians, let's not forget that, not to go into all the historiography, but there was a whole generation of American historians at the Civil War who said this wasn't about slavery at all. And they weren't all Southerners. They were Charles Beard and many other Beardians who said, no, this was all about economics. This was all about materialism. This had nothing really to do with a moral outlook on anything. It's just their pocketbooks.
But the either-orness,
Yeah.
it gets back to purity, right? The ways in which sometimes people want
Give 'em
that
a Lincoln
either-orness, right? Like, well, it has to be this. Like, this is it. Like, that's interesting ideas you have over there, but this is it. And of course, generally speaking, that's not.
Yeah. We're
how-
disappointing
that's why-
everybody.
That's
who
why
wanted-
historians are so annoying, because they will rarely give you this is it,
On
this
the
is
one
the cause,
hand, but on
this
the
is
other
the
hand.
answer.
There's actually three reasons. It's
We,
complicated.
we have to wrap up now. I just want to note
Oh,
that
how'd the time run out? That's terrible.
in our American history section of which we didn't really get to finish in our civics test here.
Oh, okay.
There are
I'm failing.
in Joanne's period, there are many individuals who get this standard formulation. Benjamin Franklin is famous for many things. Name one. Thomas Jefferson is famous for many things. Name one. James Madison is famous for many things. Name one. Alexander Hamilton is famous for many things. Name one. Looks like Abraham Lincoln is the only one who gets that in the 19th century.
Oh, that's
as I'm
so
scrolling,
founder-esque. That's so
I
founder-esque.
found this objectionable, and
Yes.
then quite strangely, the person that I'm seeing in the 20th century, well, there are two. Who do you think they are? And we'll end on this
FDR?
tribute.
Franklin Roosevelt.
It is not Franklin
J.
Roosevelt.
Edgar Hoover. No.
I wish.
Yes,
Where is
yes,
he?
yes, yes.
The key to all things. You want
Yes.
to take a go? Two men from the 50s and 60s.
From the 50s and 60s.
Oh, Eisenhower.
Eisenhower. So Dwight Eisenhower is famous for
Interesting.
many things. Name
Well,
one. And
LBJ, they had to give a Democrat.
Martin Luther King.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
So that tells us
How
a little bit
dumb of
about
us. Yeah.
how this test is constructed, but also the strange logic of
King
selection.
grew up a Republican, so they're both Republicans. Sorry.
Well, yeah, not forever.
And Frederick Douglass.
But so we're not getting to the 20th century for another few weeks.
Long time yet.
So
Several lectures.
what's coming up, David?
What's coming up is I will start Reconstruction in the middle of the Civil War, because that's where all the discussions of Reconstruction began. And I will try to show how important emancipation was in shaping the great debates of Reconstruction, and why Reconstruction is such a totally unprecedented set of challenges that the founders could never have anticipated. And the creators of Reconstruction, frankly, hadn't anticipated very well either. They're going to have to make it up as they go, too, just like your founder. The second founders are going to be making it up as they go, just like your first founders.
Cool.
We'll leave it there.